In the late hours of September 25th, The Hollywood Reporter broke the scoop that Kevin Feige of Marvel Studios fame will be developing a Star Wars movie for Disney. I'm not saying these aren't good news for Star Wars, but I am saying you're gonna have to put a lot of goodwill into it to interpret this as anything other than a stunning admission of defeat on the part of Lucasfilm. In this editorial, I will go through this article and share my interpretation of just how damning it is for the state of Star Wars, Kathleen Kennedy, and what this could mean going forward. Walt Disney Studios co-chairman Alan Horn told The Hollywood Reporter that Lucasfilm's Kathleen Kennedy is pursuing a new era in Star Wars storytelling, and knowing what a die-hard fan Kevin is, it made sense for these two extraordinary producers to work on a Star Wars film together. On the surface, that might seem logical, so you could be forgiven if your first instinct is to buy into that narrative. After all, Kevin Feige is such a huge Star Wars fan that he has a penchant of cutting off the character's arms in his Marvel movies because it was done to Luke Skywalker. So he is a fan, and his work for Marvel Studios makes him just about the most successful producer in history. So what's the problem here? We're about to see. But before we do, I must remind you that YouTube has made a change to the algorithm, which is why you for the last couple of months have been getting more and more videos from corporate channels in your recommendations. Much of it stuff you never asked for. Well, that happens at the expense of independent commentary such as this. Which is why most of your favorite independent channels have taken a hit in the same time frame. If you do enjoy the content we make, then please help us out by liking the video, watching it till the end, and if you really like it, then help share it. All of that will help us traverse the obstacles independent channels have been presented with as of late. With that out of the way, let's get back to the problems with letting Feige take on Star Wars, because there are a couple actually. The first one is that Kevin Feige reportedly offered his services to Star Wars as early as when Disney first acquired Lucasfilm, but at the time he was rejected. The reasoning then was that they wanted him on Marvel only, as Lucasfilm would be run by Kathleen Kennedy, and they didn't want that kind of crossing of streams. This made sense, because even if he were only to use his producer hat, having the head of Marvel Studios, another division within Disney, produce on Kathleen Kennedy's turf would call into question who really runs the show at Lucasfilm. To the public, that just might have looked as though the most high-profile female executive in the industry was being sidelined by Kevin Feige. Not a good look. Another problem, although I use the term lightly right now, is that Kevin Feige is a man of vision, and everyone at Marvel knows it's his way or the highway. Original Ant-Man director Edgar Wright can tell you all about what happens if your vision as director is not consistent with Feige's vision as producer and head of Marvel Studios. To those who might not know, Edgar Wright is only the original director of Ant-Man. Peyton Reed, who knows when to stand down, is the actual director of Ant-Man. Now, this is great when that producer is running the show, but not if he's working under another producer, because then they're bound to clash. What if he and Kathleen Kennedy were to disagree on a creative direction? What then? More producers isn't always a good thing. If you've seen our Conan the Barbarian retrospective, you'll recall that when Dino De Laurentiis took over the Conan movie, he bought out Edward Pressman, the producer who had set the whole movie up and secured the services of both star Arnold Schwarzenegger and director John Milius. Because Dino didn't want another producer playing in the sandbox, which was now his. If you haven't seen that retrospective, go check it out after you've seen this, but the same argument comes into play here. The key takeaway here is that Disney didn't want Kevin Feige involved with Star Wars back then, and there were very good reasons for it. But that was then. This is now, and Star Wars has gone to hell in the meantime. Some argue that the rot set in as early as The Force Awakens, and a case can be made for that, but Star Wars really veered off a cliff with The Last Jedi. At the time, the media hailed it as a masterpiece, and gaslighted everyone who had issues with it as racist, misogynist Trump supporters on the fringes of the internet. Now, that same media is labeling the movie as controversial. Solo flopped, the merchandise collected dust, and Galaxy's Edge tanked so bad the executive in charge was fired. And from what we're hearing, there is extreme worry behind the scenes that Rise of Skywalker could, well, if not end, then permanently diminish the Star Wars IP. That would explain why they now come running to Kevin Feige. If Rise of Skywalker doesn't work, whatever comes next has to. For that, they will have to pull out the big guns, and that would be Kevin Feige. But that they would bring the head of Marvel Studios into the fray is hardly a ringing endorsement of their faith in Kathleen Kennedy. This whole thing reminds me a little bit of Justice League. Remember that? Warner were not happy with Zack Snyder following the reception to Batman v Superman, and many executives wanted to fire him from Justice League, its direct sequel. However, Justice League was scheduled to film just weeks after Batman v Superman opened, so there was no way to do that without incurring gigantic additional expenses. Snyder was in a position where he couldn't be fired. He could be sidelined though, and he was. Buck Stops Here guys were placed over him, and they decided to bring in Joss Whedon to salvage things. Publicly though, this was spun as if Snyder had asked Whedon to come in and help him write some new scenes. That was just the beginning. Although the reasons differ, Kathleen Kennedy is also in a position where she can't be fired. The Hollywood Reporter even says so. Disney has been criticized for its lack of women in top roles at the company, so any move to displace Kennedy may create perception problems. That's another way of saying it doesn't matter how incompetent she is. Firing such a high-profile female executive would reflect poorly on Disney for political reasons. They can sideline her though, and they have done so several times over. In an interview last year, Bob Iger made it clear that he is the Buck Stops Here guy on Star Wars now, not Kathleen Kennedy, although she formally should have had that role. This article does try to spin it as if Kennedy was the one behind bringing Feige in, but it was in all likelihood Iger himself who made that call. Doing so signals that if he had any faith left in Kathleen Kennedy before, it is gone now. The article even points out that Disney didn't appoint her, George Lucas did, and she came with the package deal. It specifies, Kennedy has been president of Lucasfilm since 2012. She is one of the very few women in top executive jobs at Disney, but she was picked for the job by Lucas before he sold his company for $4 billion that year. In September of 2018, she renewed her contract for 3 years. I feel it should be pointed out that when her contract was extended last year, Disney didn't announce it. You'd have expected at the very least a press release, but no, utter silence. The only reason we know that she was renewed is because someone, probably in her camp, leaked it to the press. She will, in all likelihood, continue to serve out her contract, but how much control she really has, that we don't know. I'm inclined to believe, though, that if Kennedy and Feige disagree on, well, anything really, then Disney are going to side with Kevin Feige. So who really calls the shots at Lucasfilm? I think that answer will change with time. On paper, it's Kathleen Kennedy. In practice, it's Bob Iger. For now. A couple of years from now, who can say? This article suggests that Kevin Feige will only work with Kathleen Kennedy on one Star Wars film. But that opens the door to a whole new round of questions, such as, which one? Is this a new movie in addition to those already announced? Or is this the first movie in the Benioff and Weiss trilogy he will oversee? If so, are they still involved? And in either event, why stop at one? In addition to the questions though, this also leaves me with a concern, because to the extent of which it was possible, this has me worry even more for Rise of Skywalker than I already did. Feige obviously isn't working on that, but bringing him in now suggests to me that Rise of Skywalker must be a hot mess. This is when they should try to get fans more excited about that. Instead, it looks like they're saying, never mind that previous trilogy, we don't need to talk about that ever again. Here comes Feige to save the day in the next one. Do you think he will? Could Kevin Feige do better with Star Wars than Lucasfilm has themselves so far? Or will he find new ways of screwing it up? Or, and this is the big question, is it just too late now, no matter what they do? Let me know in the comments.